Hello, today's project is a baby quilt. I'm going to show you the step-by-step process sewing a quilt. One will be the actual putting it together and some sewing tips on how to work faster and to be efficient. It should give you everything you need to know to make a quilt for any size, whether you want to make it for a twin-size bed for the kids or if you want to make it a full-size quilt for your bed. I posted my pattern in front of me on my sewing bulletin board. When all the pieces are cut, I pin 2 triangles together using my chart to make the number of color combinations needed. 2 triangles make a square. When all blocks are pinned, we can then start sewing. And I'm ready to begin sewing. So let's get started. See this long line? That is the 5/8 seam allowance from this line to this where the seam is going to be is 5/8 of an inch. We're doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so it's the second short line right next to the 5/8. So when we put our fabric on, we need to make sure it's going to run. This whole edge is going to run right along there. Make sure you start off with a long string here. Do you want to make sure that these rows of stitching is straight? That's why it's important to concentrate your attention right on that line and try to keep your fabric on that line all the way through so you don't have a curved row of stitching. That'll also distort the shape of your square. Now here is a really great tip. Continuous sewing. Let me explain. Continuous sewing is a real time saver. Plus, it saves thread. You do not have to backstitch or cut the thread so often and start again with a long leading thread. You can just keep on sewing any number of blocks this way. There is no particular order in which to sew them at this point. We are just sewing the triangles to form the square blocks. When you come to the end of one block, pause and add the next block. Make sure that you do not stitch through both blocks at the same time. One stitch ends on the previous block and the next stitch starts on the next block. If you prefer, you can have an extra stitch between the 2 blocks. This really is such a great time saver. Remove the pins so that we can press the seams. Right now, they are still connected. I do not separate them because it's so much easier to press them while they're still connected. After the seams are pressed, you can snip the thread that connects them with either scissors or a seam ripper. I like to iron them. I like to turn them over on their face and just make sure that they lie down nice and flat. Because sometimes you pick up a wrinkle or you might have a little pucker in it. Ironing your pieces will ensure that your project will turn out neat. So it's just a good idea to just go over them one more time on the opposite side just to make sure everything's lying down flat like it should. Okay, after we have our squares, they are squares now. We took 2 triangles to make a square. We want to trim them. Now, I want to point out to you, here's our original square that we started with. You notice that we've lost some of the length, and that is because we started with 3 3/4, and because we made a seam, the seam allowance, a 1/2 inch seam allowance, took up some of that space. Okay, so I made another template of a 7 inch square. This is 7 3/4 to make 2 triangles that will finish a 6 inch square. Okay, so this is the size it should be, 7 inches once it's together. And we can, might be a good idea to put this on top. and to just double check to make sure that we've got, and it looks good. If there's need for, you can trim off the extras, and if you want to, you can trim off these little points. That'll be fine. But it's always a good idea to check to make sure everything is as it should be, because when we go to sew these together, you want your corners to match up, so you want to make sure you have some good squares. So go through and check your squares and trim them if necessary. Now if you mess up and one is too short, you might want to, with your leftover scraps, make a few more. Because if you have one that's too short, it's going to mess up how your quilt fits together. But these are looking good. The ruled acrylic rulers, made especially for quilting, make this job so much easier with a roller blade if you can afford to buy them. But it's still possible to do a good job with cardstock templates if you take the time to go over your work, checking your pieces very carefully. It is important that your squares are square. I have my quilt squares all ready to be put together. They're all trimmed and pressed, and I have them sorted by the color arrangement according to my chart. Now, this is where my little graph is going to really help me. Now, I could sew rows going down or rows going across. It really doesn't matter which way you decide to choose. You just need to know that if you choose to go this way, all of the angles will be the same. If you choose that way, every other one is gonna be a different angle. So you just got to remember that. And since I'm changing this square, so the top part is white and this top part is white, that also I need to keep in mind. That's why that's in big black, because I changed those because I wanted to make sure that there were 12 whites, and so that would be more evenly distributed. So there's one less yellow, so there'll be 12, 12, 11, 11, 12, and 12, because that's what I wanted, an equal number of the colors distributed randomly throughout the quilt, but yet I still have the chevron pattern. Okay, so the big decision is, do I sew crosswise or do I sew lengthwise? After considerable thought, I've decided I'm going to sew this seam right here, so I can do continuous sewing like I did when I was putting the halves together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew these two together, sewing that seam, and then these two, sewing that seam. So it'll still be disconnected right there, but I'll have like two, I'll be doing two at a time. I'll be arranging both of them at the same time. I just need to make sure that my points are the correct way, and then I have, my squares turned the way they're supposed to. So I sewed those two together, and then those two, and now I need to select these two. So that's this one and that one. Oops. One more look. Make sure I'm going to do this right. Let's do this on the white that way. And then the yellow is this way. So it makes that point. Okay. And there's the next two. I'm on row 4. Green and white. And the floral with the solid yellow. Make sure my point is at the bottom. So in essence, I'm getting 2 rows together at the same time. Okay, just got to keep track. I've got 4, now I'm on row 5. With this quilt, I am only doing simple squares made of 2 triangles, but you would follow the same procedure in sewing together the columns with any quilt block pattern. Once you have your blocks all put together, use the continuous sewing method to join the rows as you're sewing the columns as I'm doing in this quilt. This will also make it easier for ironing. So I've got 2 rows together. So I did 2 rows at once. They are only sewed right here. They're just joined by a tiny little thread there. And this way I can iron it. You know what's the cool thing is? I can actually do the whole quilt this way. I think I'll just go ahead and do the next row, sewing it down that way, and that way the whole quilt will be sort of put together. Great idea. So I have these 2 rows together. Next I'm going to add 1 more to join this to that. So they'll be connected just by a thread here. I'm basically sewing the little seam here, but they'll be connected this way. Still doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We'll be doing that throughout the whole quilt. Go back up to the top and we'll work on the 4th row, referring to our chart, and we'll just keep on going until we have all the rows together. Another tip to keep things organized and to help the sewing go rather quickly is to arrange our squares before we do the row. Okay, I'm doing the 4th row down, so I'm going to start off the chart on the 4th row. I'm going to start with that square right there, and I'm going to work my way up. I'm going to stack them in the position that they're going to be going on, from the bottom, then the next one. I sort of gave names to the squares. And the top one is the dots and the checks. So this is the one on the very top, and this is the one on the very bottom. So I can just, these are going to go right down the row, and I can just take it off the pile and put it on. But of course, I will always double check the chart as I go, and as I add the next square, I also double check if this is supposed to be next to white, if this green is supposed to be next to check. And that's how I can catch any mistakes, which I found 2 mistakes so far on the first row that I had to fix. And this way I can be sure that by the time I get to this last row, I'm going to have everything exactly in order as I want it. As you're going along, you'll find that with all this attached, it gets heavy. Now, my sewing machine is raised from my table. It would be better for this to be sitting down in the table so that I have a level surface, but because this is higher than that, and as we go, this gets weight and it wants to pull. So I try to keep the bulk either in my lap or up here as I'm going, and I have to really work to keep it from pulling that way. So I'm coming down the home stretch here. My last square to be attached, and we'll have all 35 pieces connected. Lay it out and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, we're taking one more look at the quilt to make sure that all the pieces are put together properly. Double checking it with our chart just to make sure. Observe how the point is not all the way at the center. Okay, it will be, because this is actually going to be part of the seam allowance once we sew this to that. Okay, now that we've got everything correct and in its right place, and everything's been double checked, now we got to press the seams open. When I'm sewing, I always keep a hot iron and an ironing board handy, because I've learned the value of it. Okay, so I folded the first row over, and I am pinning it because I want to make sure that the pressed open seams stay open. So I'm putting a pin on each side, even though I don't need to put pins really, because everything's attached by a single thread. But I just want to make sure that those seams lay flat open. And then all we have to do is sew right down that line, and those two rows will be together. Again, we are still doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you come to the end of the row, be sure to backstitch. Let's remove the pins. And I'll show you what it looks like having sewn 2 rows together. So the first 2 rows are now together. So to do the next row, we just fold this over, and we'll sew right down this side. And I'm going to pin it first, and we'll do that with each row, and then we'll have it all together. Remember how they were joined together? Well, I actually need to go through and just pick out that one stitch so that I can open the seams up and flatten them down. And observe how the corners come right to the edge, almost. That one's slightly off. We have our chevron pattern. It's basically the yellow and then the teal and the yellow and the teal, and it's sort of a zigzag pattern. Right now this is just a patchwork. The quilting is the stitching that goes on top. So there it is, all together. It really didn't take very long to put it together. And it's all pressed. Now we're ready to do the backing and the filling, and then the last touch will be the actual quilting. I am pleased with it. Now for the finishing. This little bag had enough batting for 2 baby quilts. Cut the batting to fit the quilt. Since this is a small quilt, I opted to sew the top to the back by placing them right sides together and then turning it. I do not usually finish a quilt that way, but I didn't want to use any type of a binder around the edge of this small quilt. I left a large opening at the bottom of the quilt for me to slip in the batting. I reached up inside the quilt to gently pull the filler to the top, smoothed it out, then pinned it on the top two corners with large pins. That held the batting in place while I smoothed it out inside. To finish off the quilt, I folded the ends of the opening inside and pinned them. Then I went around the outside perimeter of the quilt with the sewing machine with a top stitch. For the quilting, I decided to follow the zigzag pattern of the chevron with the sewing machine. Baby quilts are small enough to quilt on the machine. You do have to roll them up so that you can fit them through the machine. It's just how I imagined it to be.